So welcome to everyone to this new webinar of International Academy of Cytology. It is a pleasure today for me to have a young, very young colleague, Dr. Jarryd Lunn. He's a resident in pathology, and it's really a pleasure to have such a young pathologist and cytopathologist giving a talk in our webinar series. Dr. Lunn graduated at the University of Cape Town, and despite his young age, he already did some presentation, poster presentation to several congress, and he also had some recognition for his work on cytology and pathology. And as he is young, he will speak today about artificial intelligence in cytology, and we will hear your talk with great interest. I remember you to mute your microphone, and if you have any question, you can use the chat. And at the end of the talk, Dr. Lunn will answer to your question. So thank you very much, Dr. Lunn. It's up to you now.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I just want to move that. There we go. Thank you very much for the introduction, Prof. Bongiovanni. As Prof said, I'm Jarryd Lunn. I'm in my third year of training at the University of Cape Town National Health Laboratory Service that is attached to Groote Hospital, the Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa. Today I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence in cytopathology and what I think is a very exciting frontier and something that is going to be a friend to the cytopathologist. So today I plan to be very optimistic. I think this is a very exciting space, not only for the how far this can take this field, but also for things like social improvements within communities and equity within health, which I will speak to. Oh, hang on. Sorry, there we go. I have no disclosures other than I'm not an expert in either of these fields, really a novice with an interest. References for quoted material I've generally quoted at the bottom of the slides. If there are any that are missing or required, I can supply those. So I've divided the talk into two parts. The first is just a sort of general overview of some of the concepts and lingo that one hears about when we talk about artificial intelligence. And then the second, we'll look at examples of where artificial intelligence has been applied. So the first thing with artificial intelligence and in medicine and in healthcare is it's something that's coming to humble our profession. What it's showing us is that we as humans, as human evaluators in healthcare, are not the best. Machines can outperform us in many realms. And are in many ways easier to operate. We have, I think this paper quite interestingly sees our running costs as high, our update costs as high. And when we compare those two machines are naturally can outperform us in these. And so we as clinicians will need to adapt to our role, not only as information holders, but information integrators, interpreters, while maintaining our patient support, which is the connection that we will maintain. And the paper is going to talk about how the education system will also need to adapt to do that, to enable future doctors to hold their place in healthcare. There's some common terminology that is used when we talk about AI. Artificial intelligence, AI, is a general term for any program or instance that answers a certain problem. It often uses things like logistic regression in order to answer those questions. Within artificial intelligence, we have machine learning. And machine learning are generally algorithms through which input data is passed without explicit programming, and then using different tools. These machines are then aimed to try and solve or categorize or understand the data that is being fed into them. So the machine learning algorithm really is the center or the node for artificial intelligence. If one considers one machine learning algorithm in isolation, it has sort of limited capacity. But if one imagines taking multiple of these algorithms and connecting them to each other, just as the neurons in our brains connect, so we generate what is referred to as a neural network. So in other words, an interconnected mesh of machine learning algorithms that communicate with each other and generally feed forward into each other in order to further process data. And now when we have multiple of these neural networks and we begin to stack them on top of each other to allow them to engage differentially, we generate what is called deep learning. And the convolutional neural networks are the sort of most famous type of architecture for these deep learning networks. Now, AI has surpassed all of this. There's quantum computing that is coming in. There's spatial search techniques that are coming in, but these are the sort of core. And I think knowing these terms helps a person enter this realm of artificial intelligence. So I've just included these. There are different types of machine learning. There are three major types, that is of supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. And what is emerging is that a semi-supervised mechanism, which is a sort of a crossover of these, is being used a lot in healthcare and indeed in cytopathology. So first, looking at supervised and reinforcement training, what these require, sorry, I just want to move that out of the way, is training. So what we need to do is we take training data sets, that is data that we have labeled, that we have information on, and that we call the ground truth. And we sequentially feed this into the algorithm. Each instance has particular characteristics, so that are then fed into an algorithm that has bias factors, or has factors against which the information is tested or placed. These are these factors here. And during the training phase, we push this data through. It's fed through into a loss function. And what the machine needs to do is it needs to compare its output to the true output. When that works, the machine has succeeded. When it hasn't, the machine then alters these weightings. And what the supervised learning allows for is robust forecasting, which is what these machines are aiming to do. When these are deployed, these values over here in the model are optimized and are generally static, unless we use what is called reinforcement learning, which is where we allow the machine to make adaptation on those optimized parameters longitudinally in order to understand and adjust to changes that may be happening within a particular, with data that is being fed, which allows for adaptability within these machines. Unsupervised learning allows for what is called cluster, or what is referred to as clustering. This is a very simple explanation, but I like the diagram. Often unsupervised learning is referred to as a sort of black box learning, where what we do is we give a machine data, and we take a step back. And what the machine then does is it compares all the elements and tries to find commonalities. So in this data set of animals, it's managed to identify birds, fish, and in this category of cat, dog over here. And one can see, and what we are left to do is then to try and understand how this machine has interpreted these data sets. And so the algorithm aims to structure this data based on commonalities that it finds. And so it clusters it based on identifying features. And so one can see how the value in that, and that this is often used for explorative research, where commonalities or features that are similar are not necessarily known, but one can also see the complication that come in with this, where human understanding of differences may not be always replicated by the machine. Sorry, this is just a nice summary diagram. I thought these diagrams were useful. So when we have supervised learning, we have labeled data that is trained through functions that allow either for regressive type outputs or classifications. We have unsupervised learnings, where the raw data is fed through unknown functions that allows for clusterings, associations, and dimensional reduction. Reinforcement learnings here, where you have this continual feedback between the elements in order for the machine over or to longitudinally learn. And then, as we've said, semi-supervised means, which are often a combination of multiple things, or at least generally a combination of supervised and unsupervised techniques. So then next, once we have these individual machines, like we said, we place them in these large neural networks. Some neural networks are simple. We have an input layer, an output layer, and then this hidden layer in between where elements are communicating with each other. These individual nodes are sometimes referred to as perceptrons. And again, they're just individual units that has one or more weighted connections, a transfer function that combines the input in some way, and then in some way outputs that either into another node or as the final output. Deep feed-forward mechanisms are where you have multiple layers or multiple hidden layers that are intimately connected to each other, like as seen in this diagram. And what this allows for is a greater performance, and it has been demonstrated in literature. What it does also require is larger amounts of data to sift through these feed-forward networks and for the machine to learn. Convolutional networks are something that are seen a lot in cytopathology research and the things that I've read, where it's a means of image processing that extracts features through several initial convolution and pooling mechanisms, and that are then fed through into a network in order to generate an outcome. So neural networks in cytology, generally what we have is we utilize whole slide imaging. First we have a cell level assessment and understanding, where regions of interest are extracted, are categorized and go through neural networks, and we have a cell level result. What then happens at the level of a slide is you have the slide being divided into these patches, or what are referred to patches, or these squares, and each of those individual squares is then assessed using those neural networks in order to classify, in order to get a whole slide level result. So at this point, one has to acknowledge that artificial intelligence hasn't only seen positive benefit. Artificial intelligence has also begun to unmask some of the racial biases that exist within our existing data sets. The classic example was machines that were designed to detect melanoma. And of course, melanoma is very easy to see in a person with a fair skin like myself. But a person who has dark skin, who we know are less likely to get melanoma, but are more likely to die from melanoma, these machines are unable to detect that because they haven't been trained on darker skin. And so we can see how this AI and these machines may actually further embed racial bias and prejudice. And this editorial from about just over a year ago, I thought was very interesting, because they made the point that these health disparities have to be addressed in order for us to move forward with machine learning. We have to be able to revise the categories of data that are placed in our systems. And we have to state what data we're placing in our systems. And this comes down again to annotating data so that we understand who and what these data sets are, so that we don't perpetuate these biases that may very well exist and lead to the disadvantaging different groups. So that's the end of just the first part, which is just a very brief introduction to the ideas of artificial intelligence. So next I'm going to look at artificial intelligence in a couple of areas, and I've tried to use each of these to demonstrate some element where I think things may be useful or interesting. So the first is, and probably the widest used, is that of artificial intelligence in cervical cytopathology. And it's had an interesting and a very quite a long history, starting interestingly, I think, with the CLI-88, which was set up to combat the hazards of work fatigue. And one of the ways to do that is to outsource some of the tasks that we need to streamline our workflows. PapNet and AutoPap were the first systems available. I'm going to just look at PAPnet. They then progressed to several other tools that have gained FDA approval, and I'll be looking at one or two of those as we go through the rest. So, as I've said, PAPnet was the first available AI for cervical screening. It was the first automation assisted system that, interestingly, was a rescreener. It wasn't a primary screener. What would happen is slides would be scanned as they would normally by a cytopathologist or cytopathologist. The negative slides would then be sent off for screening by the PAPnet system using, and when it was investigated, they used either 64 or 128 images. All cases then had to be re-reviewed by a cytopathologist who would classify and review the glass slides based on the findings of the PAPnet system. PAPnet was shown to be catching cases that we were missing. The initial study showed that PAPnet only missed between 2.3 and 3% of the positive cases that were initially screened as negative. And so we've seen a system that is identifying missed cases with a narrow margin, and so is ensuring that more people are receiving an accurate diagnosis. But unfortunately, PAPnet failed for a couple of reasons. One, many of its ideas, I think, were ahead of its time. It came out in a time where data sharing was still very difficult. And so there had to be physical transportation of data. Nowadays, we can transfer large amounts of data online. There was only a modest increase in the sensitivities gained through this rescreening. Several groups also looked at whether PAPnet could be used as a primary screening tool, and they showed no significant difference between PAPnet and conventional manual screening. And so there was no justification for this very high cost. It cost around $40,000 US per life year saved. And so unfortunately, PAPnet went bankrupt in 2000. But what it did do is it opened up a field for many newer technologies, some of which utilized the new liquid-based sampling that was becoming more popular, and like Focal Point, which actually used conventional pap smears. These systems differed in that they were primarily screened by a computer. Or by an AI system. If that automated system thought that no further review is needed, many of these systems would allow those cases to be signed out. Suspicious areas, though, in cases where there were areas of interest, would have to be reviewed by the cytopathologist or pathologist, and many of these then would have to have a full slide review, and this different based on different systems. The one that is most known, I think, to us in South Africa, and the one I've chosen to look at is the ThinPrep imaging system, which is a whole slide imager that selects 22 fields of interest in approximately 90 seconds of scanning. The cytopathologist then reviews all 22 of those. If all 22 of those fields are considered normal, the case may be signed out. If abnormal, those slides will then undergo manual review. And so when the system was sort of first assessed, there was a comparative study that looked at the diagnostic sensitivity specificity between conventional manual and then these imager screen slides, with using consensus truth diagnoses for cases that had been screened. I think in this one was initially by 3 pathologists. There were some 9,500 cases that were used, and they found an initial 93% agreement, which left about 780 odd cases to be reviewed manually. And what they showed is that the images of the ThinPrep system actually detected about 6% more HSILs than manual screening and improved the false negative rate by approximately 7%. There was equal sensitivity and specificities overall, slightly more sensitive in ASCUS cases, as we can see here. But overall, they showed that the imager was at least as good as a manual screening. Now, when these systems were first trained, they were trained using squamous cells, and so there was concern that these systems may not detect adenocarcinoma. And there was a fair amount of literature that investigated whether these systems could detect adenocarcinoma, and most of them came out positive and showed that ThinPrep imaging systems were effective in detecting atypical glandular cells and atypical glandular elements. with different recommendations being made by different authors for the implementation of these systems, which were already FDA approved. So coming back, the bottom line was that Imager is at least as good as manual screening. And so one then says, well, so what? You know, we have manual screeners who are able to do that. But the important thing was that Imager-assisted screening could increase output by up to around 200%, which means that cytopathologists and cytotechnologists could get more cases done in the same amount of time using this automated screener. And that is where the power of this particular AI comes in. And if I think about it in a South African or sub-Saharan context, this is where things get exciting. So sub-Saharan Africa carries a disproportionate burden of cervical cancer. South Africa has implemented screening, and so our numbers are looking better, but still nowhere near world averages. In South Africa, our recommendation and our screening programs offered structured screening for women 3 times in their lifetime. That's once every 10 years at 30, 40, and 50 years. And the aim is to detect 66% or to decrease the load of cervical carcinomas by 66%. When we break down costs, what we see is that labor costs are the greatest cost. Some provinces in South Africa are still on conventional cytology, like my own. Some provinces have moved to liquid-based. But on either of these systems, labor cost is the greatest. And so if we can use AI-driven methods to increase our throughput, or to streamline our efficiencies in these throughput, what we're able to do is effectively able to do is to drive down these labor costs per case, increase that efficiency in screening, and able to extend the reach of our program and try to detect more cases of cervical carcinoma. And this is one of the first areas where I think we can see AI beginning to work towards increased access and health equity in different settings, and settings like South Africa, where we are very much resource constrained. Following this, there was a very big trial, the Maverick trial, that took about 72,000 liquid-based samples and divided them into a manual arm and a paired automated manual arm. And they compared both the ThinPrep and the focal point systems. Unfortunately, the outcome of this showed a net 6.3% decrease in the sensitivity of the paired arm versus the manual arm, which meant that the paired arm as an automated mechanism, without, in other words, these systems would be able to sign these out automatically, showed a decrease in its ability to actually detect SIN2 by about 8% and SIN3 by about 5%, with only marginal increases in specificities. And so what this meant was that there were the inferior sensitivities of these automation-assisted readings suggested that automation-assisted reading at that point could not be recommended for primary cervical screening. And so the systems remained adjuncts at this point to screening. But since then, there's been some interesting developments. I've selected one study that I thought was particularly interesting, given its findings and given the benefit that this would have on health spending. And this was a study from 2021, and basically they used these deep learning algorithms and neural networks trained on dual stain slides, so for P16 and Ki67 or MIB1, and used these trainings, sort of trained on small tiles and areas of these in order to for the prediction of the slide diagnosis compared to the ground truth. And outcomes were compared to conventional pap smears, manual dual stain screening, and they had at least three very big data sets that were used, with some very, very interesting findings. Firstly, they showed that the AI-based system had a significantly lower positivity, which would mean a decreased referral for colposcopy, versus perhaps it decreased its referral by approximately a third, versus manual dual stain screening, it decreased by approximately 8%. But while doing this, it maintained an equal sensitivity and a slightly higher specificity than both conventional Pap screening as well as manual dual stain screening. And what this means is that a system like this, should it be implemented, would decrease the referral to colposcopy, which decreases the cost of colposcopic services, without increasing the risk of these false negatives. And so this has such important downstream changes in healthcare spending, and opening up, again, the capacity for wider screening, the capacity for more surgical services, and so on, in order to, and again, boiling down to increasing access, increasing equity in healthcare. Another interesting study that came out quite a while ago now, but showed the need for human input in these AI systems, was the study that was investigating the TIS system versus manual screening by Lozano. And what they found very interesting, they noticed that after implementation in May 2004, when compared to the previous year, they saw this massive increase in their ask rates, and their ask to SIL ratios then changed. And they noticed that this went on for the first couple of months and slowly drifted down back to more or less where it had been in the era of pure manual screening for their service. And they believe that this change actually may have been due to a new staining protocol. And I think this is a great example of where machines are not necessarily able to understand all inputs that are given to them. A change in the staining protocol that would happen in lab will change the way things look. And if systems are not necessarily trained for the intensity of staining, the particular hues of staining, those machines then will begin to mispredict. And that was seen in this lab when they noticed their ask ratios increasing. And I just thought that was an interesting example of where human thinking is required to aid these machines, despite their growing capacity. Next is just artificial intelligence in non-gynecologic cytopathology. This was a great review by FIAC, and they had some really, really nice graphics. This graphic was just a summary of various studies that they referenced in various different organ systems, quoting their relative size and relative state of where they are in terms of validation. Most studies now, as we know, will be in this realm of validation, and hopefully in future moving towards FDA approval. AI in thyroid cytopathology has seen a lot of activity, and a lot of really good sensitivities and specificities, just remembering that our origin here is not 0, but rather 80%. One can see how, although a difference in these studies are different in size, there has been a lot of really good outcomes for these investigations so far. So I chose one study that I thought was quite interesting, and it was this study that applied machine learning algorithms in order to predict malignancy in thyroid cytopathology. These authors created a screening network as well as a classifying network that were used in these systems, first to identify follicular groups and then predict the Bethesda group that those follicular groups belong to. They scanned 9 Z-stacks per slide, which is another interesting concept we'll talk about very briefly later. And they used a semi-supervised learning. So they only, of the training set of nearly 800 slides, they only annotated or explained to the machine what 145 of them were, and then let the machine figure out the rest. They used a prediction value of greater than 0.9. And what this means is that the machine had to be more than effectively 90% sure of itself in order for those groups to be considered in the diagnostic algorithms. And what that looks like on these slides is really just these small areas over here on these histograms. All of this data that was found, of these regions of interest that were found on the slide, were ignored. And so this showed the benefit of having this screening neural network that first engaged with the data before a classifier neural network would engage in order to in order to clean out the data that is generated on a cyto slide. What they showed is that their algorithms predicted correctly with sensitivities and specificities of both above 90%, and that the machine classifications matched the human error, suggesting that these machines were once again performing just as well as humans in predicting benign versus malignant. What they then also did is they took the available electronic medical records, categorized them in sort of Boolean positive for malignancy, negative for malignancy, and then fed that additional information into their network. And what we can see is that when the electronic medical records are included, our area under the curve increases. And this again is exciting in that it shows that, once again, the more information we give a system, the more that system is able to respond and give us useful information. And so, in future, when these systems are able to integrate to electronic medical records, we see how powerful they can indeed become. What they also investigated was how well these machines were at placing these cases in their precise ordinal Bethesda groupings. And what we can see when we look at malignant nodules, they get the malignant cases in the correct spectrum. But the agreement between the machine and the cytopathologist is not always great for both malignant as well as the more benign categories. And this is likely because the Bethesda categories that we're using are not clearly defined. They are ordinal groups where there is overlap, where there is a need for interpretation at times that machines will likely for a while still struggle with and struggle to grapple with, which is where we come into these systems. The next was an interesting study that looked at urine cytopathology. And this was interesting because they used open source web-based software. They scanned huge numbers of cells on single Z planes and used 6 neural networks that were overlaid to assess different cellular features and to detect not only cellular features, but slide level features that would help aid in diagnosis. They again used a semi-supervised algorithm. Of their training set, only trained with approximately 8,000 urothelial, non-urothelial cells. And a further 4,000 cells that were annotated precisely with their Paris classifications. Their system was able to scan about 36,000 cells in about 8 minutes per slide. And what that looks like is in this drop, or this dot over here. This is a quarter of a drop, and every red dot is an area that the machine was concerned for malignancy. The yellow are normal urothelial cells, and the blue is other. And it just demonstrates the amount of information that these machines are able to engage with in very short periods of time. Their system showed very good accuracy. They had accuracy of about 84%, and very good area under the curve that correlated with that. Unfortunately, only about 150 cases had histologic follow-ups, and when they looked at the concordance of artificial intelligence with manual, artificial intelligence did outperform manual screening. But what was interesting was when more information, sufficient information, was fed into the system, the machines were able to learn slide-specific or specific slide-level features. So when the researchers told the machine whether these samples were instrumented or voided specimens, the area under the curves greatly increased. When the machine was not told how these specimens were obtained, one can see how that area under the curve markedly decreased. And once again, just demonstrating how if good tailored information is given to these machines with sufficient clinical detail, which is unfortunately often lacking, these machines are able to perform just as well, if not outperform, manual screening. The next is a very interesting case, and the one that probably got me the most excited. But to sort of prelude to it, I'd just like to again talk about health equity and health inequities, which is a universal problem in most countries, including South Africa, where we have a public service that supports 71.5% of our population. And we have a massive urban-rural divide. And we have something in South Africa called the Batupele principles that are meant to change how we approach service delivery. And one of those is around access. And when we look at the urban-rural divide in South Africa, we can see that our most developed province, Gauteng, only has around 4% rural population. But provinces like Limpopo and the Northern Cape have upwards of 80–90% rural population, which is driving health inequity in our country. And so that's when this next study becomes very interesting. It was an investigation into pancreatico-biliary cytopathology. And it was a learning system that was really acting as a proof of concept, where they retrospectively took about 5,500 images from multiple patients who had undergone rows. They divided these into multiple data sets for multiple different testings that were done. But what the system was aiming to do is to classify as sufficient and malignant or non-malignant. And so they had the semi-supervised algorithm with these annotated images. The authors would specify various transformations on the annotated images and would help the machine to understand cancer versus non-cancer in both cancer only, normal only, and in slides where one does have overlap. And the aim of this is that a machine that can scan the slide can scan this remotely. And so outlying areas where there aren't perhaps cytopathologists available can be serviced by cytopathology services. What was a nice finding is the group compared the performance of their system to the endoscopists. Good news, endoscopists will not be taking our job. The neural network well outperformed the endoscopists, but performed mostly just as well as a cytopathologist would. So the system, once again, was at least as good as a cytopathologist on these brilliant outcomes at rows. And so an automated system here may be a very useful adjunct in resource-limited or rural settings, such as South Africa, where A, we have a large rural population, and B, a need for more pathologists and cytopathologists to service outlying areas. And with the centralization of services, this is a great example of where artificial intelligence is enabling decentralized support without the costs and the difficulties associated with decentralized healthcare. Lastly, there are many emerging technologies that are coming out which on FNA specimens use various analytes, DNA, mRNA, proteins. But this was one of the most interesting that I came across. And it's a technology called Cytopan, which is a portable cellular analytic technique for rapid point-of-care diagnostics. It's a non-morphologic method using a limited antibody panel that in under an hour can screen breast FNAs. It's novel. There are currently no studies which have compared it to normal breast FNA. And it uses this white box algorithm for classifications. But what is interesting, again, is that it can give results in less than an hour. In other words, in less time than it takes a patient in South Africa to get their medications at the pharmacy. And the quoted cost in this study was around $5 for the reagents for each test. And so what the study group showed multiple things, but they used different stains. They used adapting to stain the nuclei. They used a stain called Quad, which stained for EpCAM, HER2, EGFR, and MUC1, as well as ER and PR in the HER2 identified tumor cells, in order to classify the cells that were extracted into the classic molecular categories of breast carcinoma. And so they trialed this in 68 patients with suspected breast carcinomas. Their cutoffs, they had to have more than 50 cells. The cells had to be more than 8 micrometers, and they used CD45 to screen out lymphocytes and other cells. There was about 9% that was suboptimal, 5% that were inconclusive, but in the remaining, based on histologic correlation, there was a 100% accuracy in cancer diagnosis, 93% accuracy in ER/PR status, and 96% accuracy in HER2 status. And so again, an example of artificial intelligence that, although removed from visual cytopathology, is using cytopathologic assessment for cheaper on-site expedited results, which again streamlines healthcare services and ultimately leads to better patient equity and better access to the services that a particular patient would require, which is in a very, I think, a very exciting realm for us going forward. There are, of course, challenges that are existing in the AI cytopathology interface as it stands. Different technologies use different samples. There are different sampling techniques. There's always the issue of specimen adequacy and inadequate specimens, clouding data sets, how specimens are processed and stained, as well as clinician acceptance of AI-assisted or AI-driven diagnostics. Issues around pathologic classification and criteria. Many of our systems, again, don't have true ordinal separated categories in cytopathology. And so these overlapping features, like we saw in the thyroid example, create problems for, or make it difficult for AI systems to truly separate into the categories required. There's also no 100% accurate gold standard or ground truth that we need. And so we have to have huge amounts of consensus data. And those consensus data sets are very labor intensive to produce. There's no consensus on how we annotate our data, because the data set that person A annotates and that person B annotates must have overlap and we must be able to use them together in order for the data that we have and that we have at our disposal to be useful. And we need large trained data sets, especially in these complex convoluted networks, in order for these systems to be accurate. There is obviously always the technology and technical aspects, and Professor Chong made a presentation available on ResearchGate that graphically demonstrates these very well. But data files are very, very big. A single histology slide can be in the realm of sort of 2 to 5 gigabytes of data. A single cytology slide can be upwards of 20, 30 gigabytes of data. And so we need very, very big data control capacity to be built in order to deal with the amount of data we need to generate. The next issue is that of Z stacking. So in Cyto, whenever we look at a slide manually, we often scrolling up and down in order to get a 3D understanding of the groups that we're looking at. And when we scan a slide, we generally scan on a single Z stack. Now, if you have a 20 gigabyte image and you need 6 Z stacks, you're now looking at just an enormous amount of data per slide that we're scanning in order to assess it on multiple different levels. And again, issues associated with imaging quality, the type of processing, image processing, as well as processing power needed in the computational analysis of these. And we do continue to need increased understandings of these semi and unsupervised models to understand their risk of clinical error. At this point, the regulatory and legal issues are largely undefined, and there aren't always EQA, or for many realms aren't EQA programs available for this standardization. And so the AI cytopathology interface does have its challenges that need to be met. So nearing the end, what do we as cytopathologists now need to do? So this was a great review article by Professor McAlpine and Michelin that looked at the cytopathologist's role in evaluating artificial intelligence in our diagnostic practice. And they give this summary of the role that the pathologist needs to play. But what they stress is that we don't need to know all the technical details of a particular, how algorithms work or how they're programmed or structures, but we do need a basic theoretic understanding of these methods in order to be key role players in deciding, for argument's sake, the metrics that need to be used, deciding in how data sets are going to be generated, and on the interpretation of these results and to evaluate the performance of these models. I like the summary where they said cytopathologists need to become informed consumers of AI algorithms. And I think if we can get that right, we stand to gain so much, not only in capacity for our day-to-day practice, but in capacity for, again, patient access as well as patient equity. For countries like my own in sub-Saharan Africa, the question is always, what do we need to begin doing to start our AI journey? And for countries that are not as advanced, the things we need to be doing is firstly learning to properly annotate our data and our available data, and what are likely vast and untouched data sets and data sets of special populations like in Africa that are not studied. We need to engage in programming and in artificial intelligence to gain the requisite ground knowledge so that we can enter AI cytopathology spaces and engage actively and understand the direction that things are taking. We need interdisciplinary collaborations to begin building health systems frameworks, frameworks not only within the healthcare sector, but frameworks within political spheres in order to begin building acceptance and begin building capacity for these systems. And we really do need to create international collaborations to build data sets that represent, in our case, Black African data, in order to increase representation of populations for future generalized data sets that may be used in commercial products that we ourselves may then begin using. So just a few take-home points. Artificial intelligence has, in cytopathology, been shown to have accuracy, sensitivity, and specificities that are as good, if not occasionally better, than conventional screening. We still need to see that diagnostic supremacy in very large randomized controlled trials and in FDA-approved systems. But this increased capacity, this increased utilization of hybrid techniques may enable us to better triage in cytopathology and hence sometimes direct health spending. AI techniques have the ability to increase throughput, as we've said, enable a wider reach, as we discussed with the example of Rose, and it creates digital connections without the need for physical presence. So again, that idea of the decentralization of centralized services without the old school associated cost and associated complication. And there may be a space for non-morphometric or morphologic techniques that we may see coming in. And at the bottom, I'm not sure if it can be seen. I haven't touched on it, but in my opinion, our jobs are safe and our jobs will be safe for a very long time. So I'd just like to give sincere thanks to the IC, to Prof. Bongiovanni for allowing me to give this talk, and to Prof. Michela for her recommendation, to the GSH UCT Department of Anatomical Pathology, as well as the NHS ECHO platform for their support, and all the authors whose work I cited, whose work really is inspiring. This is a picture of Table Mountain. This the mountain that every Cape Townian obsesses over, taken about an hour after sunrise. This is Groote Hospital on the bottom of Devil's Peak over there, that's Lion's Head. And this is about half the team that I spend most of my days with. So thank you everyone for your time and your attention. I'm going to open the chat now to see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Jarryd, for this wonderful presentation. I like that what you said about the fact that we have to engage ourselves is in artificial intelligence, trying to understand more what is behind all this program and the algorithm. And I have a question concerning the test for breast cancer, the pan-cyto. Is there a system, the system also recognizes if a specimen is representative or not, or is just a question of combination of antibodies and then the system knows that it's not breast tissue, for example?
Sure. I think there was a built-in assessment of adequacy, because in their testing sets there were some that were rejected on the basis of inadequacy. Yeah.
And all the other systems also do not require human assistance in saying that the specimen is representative or not, right?
Sure. So it's something I didn't touch on many of them, and it is one of the difficulties, because a machine not only has to be taught the particular area of cytopathology that it's intended for, but it also has to be taught how to assess things like adequacy, which can be very difficult, and is an entire training set on its own, and as we know, differs for different classification systems. And it is a very difficult area, because often when these systems are trained, they're trained on adequate slides. And so inadequate slides are a bit of a spanner in the works often in these cases for these systems, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So you can check in the chat if you want to see.
Sure.
Try out a question.
There's a couple. There was a question from, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing names. I think Sarah Zonner, who said, if I understand you correctly, the training set of the imager was another set other than the set that it was tested on in the study. Because it's proprietary, I don't think they fully disclose that. But one assumes that there was a dedicated training set that imager would have used. The next one from Mario Taliana. He comments on how his department is moving to digital pathology and histopathology, but would prefer to hold back for cytopathology because there are no tried and tested adaptations to scanners. And then says, do you agree that we should wait a bit more before we implement whole slide scanning in cytology? So with systems like Focal Point, with systems like the ThinPrep imager, we have FDA approved systems. So for those areas where there is FDA, where there is approval of systems, I think we should start using those. I think we can see how those systems can streamline our services. So where there are approved, tested instruments, I think we should use them. It is a difficult jump to make, and it takes a lot of training and it takes a lot of adaptation in the department. But I think if we can get on board for, let's say, cervical cytopathology, when a system becomes available for the thyroid, it's a lot easier for departments to adapt. So I think if the opportunity is there, it should be taken. The next one. Oh, that's interesting. From Sarah Jiang, asked if, or comments around how in underserved areas, there are often more access to smartphones rather than computing devices, desktops. In looking at the field, have you seen any applications leveraging smartphone technologies? I must be honest, I didn't specifically look in this when preparing for this talk. I have seen several for things like retinal scanners. So I know colleagues in other clinical fields are using them, but it would be really exciting, and it would, with the capacity of our smartphones nowadays, I think be very doable. And I'm sure there is research in that. I just personally haven't seen it. Let me.
Yeah, there is a question about getting any certificate of education, continuing medical education for this session. No, it's not. We have not. We don't deliver a certificate if you participate to this section. And then there are a lot of comments about your excellent talk. So thank you.
I think.
And I think there is another question from Zara.
Yes, from Sarzono, who says, do you expect explainable AI to play a pivotal role in establish well understood models for analysis? That's an interesting question, because it boils down to, I think, to the difference in the sort of white box supervised versus black box unsupervised approach. I think for diagnostic purposes at this point, most systems will probably be the explainable AI that is going to push these models. But I think we mustn't lose sight of black box learning, because I think machines, especially with the sort of movement towards the sort of super AI that is coming out, that I stayed away from in this talk. We are learning things from the machines. We're learning elements that we didn't previously understand or didn't know were there. And so that sort of black box learning may drive better classification. It may drive a better understanding of the samples that we're feeding into these machines. So to answer your question, hopefully a bit of both. What do you think about using AI in cytopathology's synthetic plastic? There's a question from Evgenia Kozorezova, sorry, I may have butchered your name, who asks about Syntec plus staining. My apologies, I don't know what Syntec plus staining is, so I'm going to be unable to answer your question. Yeah,
it's a double staining with
is it just double staining?
KI67 and P16 in cervical cytology.
In South Africa, we don't, as far as I know, have access in state. I think our private services have started using it though. I think as that study showed, I think it is a very exciting space, because one of the things I didn't comment on that study is that they were examining very, very few, they were at cases examining 1 or 2 cells and making very accurate calls based on those. From what I've read about that dual staining, it is very not only labor intensive, but labor intensive in terms of the skill required to review those slides. And if we can train machines to do those tedious tasks, just as we require machines to do our Ki67 counts in normal tissue or detect, acyphotic bacilli on slides, and so if we can farm off those very time-consuming techniques, we free up manpower for so many other tasks, either to increase our throughput or to increase capacity for quality control, for review. So I hope that we do see Syntec plus staining techniques in validated services. Do you have experience with cytoprocessor? I don't have experience with cytoprocessor, Miguel. I'm sorry, but I will be looking that up immediately after this talk.
And then there is another question about the use of imager for primary or secondary screening. I mean, we use it for primary.
There's, I think, 3 provinces in South Africa, who are still on conventional staining. I think there are provinces in South, or some centers in South Africa who are using it for primary. And I think there was there's one that's just popped up. Do you think it's possible to apply AI in cytology without whole slide imaging? I didn't have access in scan in my area, from Pilar Lopez. That's sure. I think it is in certain instances. So if you had a system like the pancreatic biliary one, where effectively you could have an endoscopist in a rural area putting the material on the slide, staining the slide, and looking at it under four times, let's say, it's very easy to detect groups. So if systems were like that were then designed to allow a person just to focus in on those groups, you would then definitely be able to do it without whole slide, and can do it without whole slide imaging. The caveat then is then there's always then that human error of something being missed on the slide.
Okay, so I think we are all set thank you again, also from all the participants to
Thank
this
you, everyone.
webinar. And you can see again the presentation of Dr. Lunn in our YouTube channel soon. And stay tuned on our website for next webinar announce. Thank you very much again, Lunn, and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao, bye-bye.